Welcome to Rise Fuel, where underdogs rise, justice wins, and every story reminds you no one stays powerless forever. If you love courtroom twists, neighborhood drama, and real feeling battles for what's right, you're in the right place. Imagine this: you've finally secured the home you've always dreamed of. A serene neighborhood, warm neighbors, everything picture perfect. And then, out of nowhere, the homeowners association decrees that your water pipeline is in the wrong place. So, they barge onto your property, tear up your yard, and reroute your water supply without so much as a knock on your door. Sounds like something ripped straight from a late-night comedy show, right? A situation so ridiculous you either burst into hysterics or feel like screaming from sheer disbelief. Well, that's precisely the nightmare that landed on my doorstep. But hear me loud and clear. My tale doesn't wrap up with me meekly surrendering. Oh, and by the way, has anyone else ever faced a tyrannical HOA president drunk on authority? Drop your location and unleash your juiciest HOA horror tales in the comments. Because sometimes the scariest monsters don't hide under your bed, they run your neighborhood. Anyway, my name is Clayton Reeves, a 40-year-old water systems, a specialist who cherishes solitude, strong values, and a life free of chaos. I'd just settled into what I was sure was my forever neighborhood in suburban Denver. A charming place lined with towering trees and that elusive small-town vibe nobody can seem to find anymore. The house boasted a roomy yard, mature landscaping, and, seemingly, a homeowners association that didn't appear entirely dictatorial. Clearly, I should have trusted my instincts and known better on that last front. Having spent nearly 20 years immersed in the world of water systems, I fully appreciate the significance of reliable infrastructure. What I failed to grasp was how one individual's swollen ego could transform an ordinary water line into a psychological weapon aimed squarely at my peace of mind. I still vividly recall being 8 years old when our home went dry for a week, forcing my mother to hold buckets from the neighbor's tap so we could cook and do laundry. I loathed that feeling of powerlessness and vowed to become the guy who knew how to fix water problems so no one I loved would endure that again. Before arriving in this so-called suburban paradise, I'd overhauled the water infrastructure of a small Colorado town, saving them 30% annually on costs. Water wasn't merely my profession, it was my mission. At first, the chaos trickled in slowly. Joyce Halverson, our 55-year-old HOA president, had begun peppering me with subtly hostile notes about how my hedge was ever so slightly too high and allegedly ruining our community's pristine image. Joyce was the sort of person who kept a ruler handy to measure grass height and firmly believed she was the unofficial ruler of our subdivision. She'd been a mid-tier manager in some real estate outfit for years, which, in her mind apparently, made her supremely qualified to micromanage every blade of grass on our street. I'd been meticulous with my hedges, keeping everything trim and proper, but apparently that level of diligence wasn't nearly sufficient for Queen Joyce. The particular hedge in question bordered the easement that carried my primary water line from the street to my home, which Joyce appeared to regard as a personal offense against her iron grip on the neighborhood. Every time I glanced at those shrubs, I felt a small wave of calm, imagining them as natural guardians that asked nothing except for the occasional trim. That peace shattered one Tuesday morning in late September, when I awoke to the jarring roar of machinery just outside. I stumbled out, groggy, coffee mug in hand, only to discover a crew of men wielding shovels and operating a small excavator as they obliterated my once orderly landscaping. Joyce loomed about 20 feet away, dressed to kill in high heels, oversized designer shades, and gripping a clipboard labeled landscape geometry violations in giant block letters. She gestured toward my water pipes like she'd just discovered some secret stash of illegal contraband, barking orders to the workers like a general plotting an invasion. The foreman, a grizzled man in his 50s, glanced my way as I approached. "Sorry about the noise, man. HOA says we gotta reroute this water line 'cause your hedge is messing with access." I just blinked at him, half asleep and half while my flower bed morphed into a construction massacre zone before my eyes. Interfering with access to what, exactly? I demanded, watching as they dug deeper into the earth that used to be my private sanctuary. "Dunno, man. Lady with the clipboard says it's gotta move, so we move it." The pipes they uncovered resembled twisted limbs from some horror film, warped, corroded, and dripping betrayal. Fueled by equal parts caffeine and fury, I marched over to Joyce, my coffee sloshing dangerously as I tried to keep my voice steady. "Joyce, what in God's name is happening here? Nobody asked for my approval to tear apart my property." She flashed a patronizing grin that made my fists itch. "Oh, Clayton, I'm ever so sorry you weren't kept in the loop, but the HOA possesses full authority to implement any necessary infrastructure improvements for the greater good of the community. Your hedge was creating serious maintenance obstacles." My left eye twitched as I tried to process this nonsense. Whether Joyce had ever cracked open an engineering textbook or merely binged DIY plumbing videos on YouTube was anybody's guess. But the pipe carnage littering my lawn sure looked more like a felony than a fix. Maintenance issues. I trimmed that hedge religiously every month. And when exactly did the HOA gain the right to rip up private water lines without a homeowner's consent? Joyce's smirk widened like a Cheshire cat savoring its prey. Well, if you'd bothered to read the revised community guidelines we circulated last month, you'd know that aesthetic uniformity requires unobstructed access to all utility easements. She spoke with the certainty of someone who'd never truly read the documents she was citing, counting on nobody else reading them either. By midday, my once lovely yard was transformed into an active excavation zone, and my water was completely shut off. The workers managed to reroute my main water line around the hedge, which now meant I had exposed pipes meandering across my lawn like some avant-garde sculpture from a dystopian art gallery. When I attempted to turn on my kitchen tap, not even a single drop emerged. I made the dreaded phone call. After 15 minutes on hold, I still wasn't permitted the basic courtesy of washing my hands. When the receptionist finally returned, her voice dripped with scripted politeness as she explained that all matters connected to the recent infrastructure upgrades have been addressed in accordance with community policy. Pressing further about when I might have running water again only got me transferred back to the void until finally she returned to chirp. The project manager will be in touch within 3 to 5 business days. 3 to 5 business days without water, that's not an inconvenience. That's a human rights crisis. I thought because if your neighbor has more say over your facet than you do, you're living in a dictatorship. So I resorted to buying cases of bottled water, forced to improvise every daily task. Brushing my teeth, brewing coffee, washing dishes, even showering became an elaborate logistical operation worthy of a NASA launch. I rigged up a camping shower in my own bathroom and felt like I'd been plunged into some bleak, post-apocalyptic existence. All because Joyce decided my ordinary hedge was apparently a menace to society. The sight of those raw metal pipes twisting across my ruined lawn sent my blood pressure spiking every time I glanced outside. This had grown far beyond mere plumbing issues. It had morphed into Joyce's personal power play, a way for her to show everyone precisely who held the reins in our community. Each morning I'd wake up, gaze at the war zone where my thriving garden used to be, and think back to my mom lugging those heavy buckets of water across our yard. I'd made a promise back then. Nobody deserved to live without water just because somebody else declared them unworthy of it. 2 days later, an official-looking envelope materialized on my front door. Inside, I found a formal violation notice, signed in Joyce's perfect penmanship and embossed with the HOA's official seal. The letter charged me with landscaping infractions and obstruction of community infrastructure upgrades. But the real bombshell came in the fine print at the bottom. All residents are hereby restricted to 15 minutes of continuous water use per session, in accordance with new community conservation efforts. I read that line several times, stunned. Joyce wasn't merely punishing me, she was inventing fresh methods to strangle the entire community's freedom. Standing on my porch clutching that absurd notice, I watched rainwater from the night, before coursing through tiny rivers around the exposed pipes in my yard. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. More water was streaming freely from the sky than Joyce would now allow me to use inside my own house. That evening, I sat alone in my dark kitchen, sipping from a bottle of water and glaring at the letter illuminated by my phone's flashlight. The silence, where my refrigerator's humming ice maker once purred, felt suffocating. Joyce had somehow managed to escalate my simple wish for a peaceful existence into medieval siege tactics. But as I sat there brooding in the darkness, something shifted in my brain. I dedicated my entire professional life to understanding water flow, pressure, mechanics, and devising creative fixes for seemingly hopeless problems. Joyce might believe she'd won the first battle, but she'd just unwittingly declared war on a man who knew the ins and outs of water systems better than anyone, and never underestimate a quiet man with a wrench and a grudge. The following morning, I resolved to tackle this mess like a civilized human being. I suited up in my sharpest business casual attire and headed over to the community center where the monthly HOA meeting was set to convene. I told myself that if I could simply lay out the facts, keep calm, and appeal to everyone's reason, we could sort out this lunacy without sparking further chaos. I should have known better than to expect rational behavior from someone who measures fence heights like a military operation and treats shrubbery as a national security concern. Still, hope is the last thing to die, even when your pipes already have. There's something deeply unsettling about living in a house where basic needs require approval from someone who sees your hedges as an existential threat. The community center was buzzing with roughly 30 residents, most of whom I recognized from polite nods and short chats over the previous months. Gary O'Connell, a 45-year-old accountant who lived 3 doors down, flashed me a sympathetic look when I arrived. Gary always struck me as level-headed, the sort who probably got sucked into HOA politics despite having better things to do. Just a few weeks earlier, I'd helped him troubleshoot a persistent sprinkler leak, and we'd bonded over the countless ways home ownership can suck your soul and your bank account dry. I grabbed a seat in the back row and bided my time until the community concerns section of the agenda The room radiated the cold sterility of a courtroom, only missing the clinking handcuffs and numbered jumpsuits. Joyce launched the meeting with a voice dripping in the same solemn authority you'd expect from a federal judge or a general giving orders before a strike. She flicked her laser pointer over satellite images like she was planning a covert military op against my former flowerbed. She rattled off the usual talking points: landscaping updates, planning the neighborhood block party, and a heated debate over whether the Christmas decorations should follow a unified color scheme. An elderly gentleman in the front row even presented his weekly rainfall measurements, dutifully submitted for HOA records, because apparently Joyce required meteorological intelligence to maintain our suburban utopia. Finally, when she opened the floor for community issues, I stood, cleared my throat, and said, "I'd like to discuss the recent waterline alterations that occurred on my property without my knowledge or approval." Instantly, the room dropped into pin-drop silence, and I felt 30 pairs of eyes zeroing in on me. Joyce's face shifted from polite professionalism to barely hidden exasperation in the span of a single heartbeat. "Mr. Reeves," she declared, her tone dripping with the same disdain a teacher reserves for the class troublemaker. "The HOA undertook crucial infrastructure modifications in alignment with our community standards and routine maintenance obligations. Should you harbor any particular complaints about the procedures, you're more than welcome to file them in writing for board review." And that, my friends, is how a waterlined, one power-hungry HOA president turned my American dream into a suburban battlefront. Asterisk, I've held my carefully rehearsed speech dissolve into thin air as Joyce's cold, dismissive voice slammed into me like an unexpected punch. "Joyce, you ripped up my yard and cut off my water without warning. That's not routine maintenance, that's property destruction." A low buzz rippled through the room, hinting that at least a few people grasped just how outrageous this had all become. Joyce, though, was utterly unmoved, her demeanor as rigid as reinforced concrete. She clicked her laser pointer with the precision of a sniper zeroing in on a target, pulling everyone's focus back to her satellite maps. "Mr. Reeves, the HOA holds significant powers under our community bylaws. We acted solely to preserve infrastructure integrity." She paused, letting silence stretch between us for maximum effect, before continuing in a voice dripping with condescension, as if she were explaining the alphabet to a clueless toddler. "Your hedge had grown too, a height that restricted proper maintenance access to the utility easement. Rather than slap you with repeated citations, we took decisive steps to permanently fix the problem." I tried to answer, but Joyce raised her palm like a crossing guard halting traffic. "In addition, the new water conservation policies are there to encourage environmental stewardship and reduce strain on our shared resources." I forced a polite smile and said, "Thank you." Outwardly, I was playing nice. Internally, I was already calculating precisely how far Joyce's fabricated authority would stretch before it snapped under real scrutiny. Because sometimes, the sweetest revenge starts with a simple thank you. The more Joyce kept talking, the clearer it became that logic and facts weren't going to penetrate her fortress of self-importance. She'd woven a web of official-sounding justifications designed to lull anyone unwilling to question the details into complacent agreement. But what she didn't know was that I'd been recording every second of our exchange on my phone, and the inconsistencies in her narrative were beginning to pile up like debris after a storm. When I began firing off pointed questions, such as exactly which contractor had been hired for the work, she replied with hazy mentions of approved vendors and standard operating procedures. When I demanded documentation proving my hedge was allegedly obstructing utility access, she retreated into generalities about community guidelines and proactive solutions. Her answers contained as much substance as an election year campaign ad. Gary, ever the cautious neighbor, tentatively raised his hand and asked, "Joyce, shouldn't residents be notified before major work is carried out on private property?" Joyce's smile went tight and brittle around the edges, like plastic under heat. "The board is authorized to undertake any necessary action to protect community standards. We cannot afford delays waiting for individual homeowner permissions. For essential maintenance." The way she emphasized individual permission made it sound like I was demanding the right to build a missile silo in my backyard rather than asking for the basic courtesy of knowing why strangers were excavating my flower beds. A few residents nodded along, seemingly placated by her authoritative tone. I realized then that Joyce was masterfully spinning this as a matter of civic duty instead of what it truly was, a power trip disguised as community service. Watching her maneuver was like witnessing a magician perform a sleight of hand trick you knew you were being played, but the performance was slick enough to make you hesitate. I left that HOA meeting seething and alone, but also far more educated. Joyce wasn't simply capricious, she was actively avoiding any discussion of details. Every time I pressed for specific names, figures, or documents, she deflected with blanket policy jargon and catchphrases about community welfare. My phone, however, had faithfully captured every evasive syllable, and it was dawning on me that there might be more lurking behind this hedge fiasco than a petty neighbor's obsession with shrubbery. That night I listened to the recording 3 separate times. jotting down notes each time Joyce deflected or shifted topics instead of answering directly. Her so-called policy statements were longer than a primetime political debate, delivered with a smile that made me want to dial 911 for moral support. A few days later, another official envelope materialized on my doorstep, carrying the weight of impending doom. Inside was a newly minted collection of community rules, all graced with Joyce's elegant signature and the HOA's embossed seal. These rules detailed water use restrictions, mandatory approval for any landscaping alterations, and a fresh stipulation that all utility modifications had to go through officially sanctioned community partners. As I pored over the dense, bureaucratic language, a gut feeling kept gnawing at me. Joyce was erecting these elaborate policy walls not just to harass me but to hide something much bigger than a vendetta over my hedge. Because when people start rewriting the rulebook mid-game, it's usually because they're losing. And if my 2 decades of working in water systems had taught me anything, it was that whenever new rules suddenly appear from thin air, someone's usually scrambling to bury the truth. So I dug into the HOA bylaws and located Section 5. Subsection 12, a buried provision that most residents probably never read past the 3rd sentence. Joyce was about to learn the hard way that she wasn't the only one fluent in fine print. But I knew I couldn't fight this alone. That's when I thought of Rachel Hoy, a 35-year-old administrative consultant who'd once worked for the Colorado Department of Infrastructure before shifting to freelance work. We'd met at an industry conference a couple of years back where she gave a killer presentation about spotting red flags in municipal utility contracts. Rachel had this uncanny knack for picking apart bureaucratic documents, seeing patterns that would bore most people into a coma. More importantly, she could detect financial funny business from a mile away. If Joyce was cooking the HOA's books, Rachel would sniff it out like a bloodhound on a scent. I'd spent countless late nights cross-referencing the HOA's spending, with reasonable costs for similar services, and unsettling patterns were starting to leap out at my engineer's brain. Over coffee at a cafe in downtown Denver, I laid out the entire saga for Rachel. Joyce's high-handed tactics, the vague answers, and my increasing suspicion that the waterline chaos was part of a much bigger scheme. Rachel listened intently, her fingers tapping rapidly across her laptop keyboard as I talked. "Clayton, what you're describing sounds like classic administrative overreach, but this financial angle is even more intriguing. HOAs that suddenly start issuing arbitrary, new rules and funneling work through murky channels are usually hiding financial irregularities. Let me ask you this. Do you have access to any of the HOA's financial statements or vendor contracts?" I shook my head. "Not yet, but I'm about to." I wasn't planning on dumping the entire investigation into Rachel's lap. This was my fight, and I wanted to be in the trenches. That's when I remembered the transparency policy Joyce herself had smugly referenced during that HOA meeting. Under Colorado land, our own HOA bylaws, residents are legally entitled to request financial records for review. It's one of those lofty-sounding policies nobody bothers to invoke because most folks don't want to spend their weekends reading spreadsheets. But I wasn't most folks, and my patience with Joyce's bureaucratic circus had officially expired. Rachel and I drafted a formal request, citing the relevant statutes and HOA bylaws. Legally, Joyce had zero wiggle room. I wanted her to know that I wasn't just an angry homeowner waving a garden spade. I was someone who knew exactly how to untangle legal red tape. When Joyce received my request, her reaction was immediate and extremely telling. Instead of simply handing over the documents, she fired back a 3-page letter loaded with fancy legal terminology, insisting that such requests were disruptive to community operations and would require full board approval. The letter read like a security briefing for a top-secret government agency, loaded with language about safeguarding vendor relationships and preserving operational confidentiality. But all it boiled down to was a polite but firm absolutely not. Rachel read the letter, chuckled and said, "Clayton, this is textbook behavior for someone hiding financial skeletons. Nobody writes 3 pages explaining why they can't show you receipts unless those receipts are radioactive." If Joyce were a mafia don, her financial records were her machine guns, and she was guarding them like priceless relics. Determined to keep digging, Rachel leveraged her connections at the county assessor's office to access property records, utility permits, and vendor registrations linked to our neighborhood. The deeper we went, the stranger things became. Over the previous 3 years, our HOA had funneled significant sums of thousands of dollars annually to a company called Civic Flow Solutions, allegedly for infrastructure consulting and management. The payments were shockingly high for a small neighborhood with minimal infrastructure demands. When Rachel started investigating Civic Flow Solutions, the red flags practically waved themselves. She combed through Google Earth images, analyzed delivery truck activity near the listed addresses, and even matched old HOA salary data to search for potential ties between Civic Flow and people on the HOA board. The investigation began morphing into a full-fledged financial thriller, climaxing when Rachel stumbled across a vendor contract that misspelled the company. Name a rookie mistake that cracked the entire scheme wide open. It turned out Civic Flow Solutions headquarters was merely a UPS mailbox, tucked into a nondescript strip mall 15 miles away. Their website was a single generic page filled with vague corporate buzzwords about delivering municipal infrastructure solutions but offered no concrete projects or client testimonials. Rachel tried to find business licenses or contractor certifications tied to Civic Flow, but came up empty-handed. The company existed just enough to cash checks and nothing more. "Clayton, this reeks of a shell company," Rachel muttered, staring at her laptop screen. "Someone's laundering HOA funds through a fake business, and I'd bet my coffee addiction we're about to figure out who's behind it." And sure enough, Rachel hit pay dirt. Civic Flow was officially registered under the name of Michael Halverson, Joyce's nephew. Of course it was. In a flash, every bizarre puzzle piece clicked into place. Joyce was using her position as HOA president to funnel homeowners' money into a sham company run by her own family. All those suspicious infrastructure upgrades, the sudden flurry of new rules, the evasive answers, it all existed to manufacture reasons to pay Civic Flow Solutions for work that probably never actually happened. I'd gone from feeling harassed to realizing I'd been getting robbed, along with every other unsuspecting resident in our community. Rachel and I spent the following week compiling a meticulous dossier documenting every link between Joyce, Civic Flow Solutions, and the HOA spending patterns. A disturbing pattern emerged. Joyce would identify a supposed community need, authorize a payment to Civic Flow to address it, and then orchestrate changes that seemed designed more to justify the expense than to improve anything meaningfully. My waterline fiasco wasn't merely Joyce's power trip, it was camouflage for another check to Civic Flow Solutions. The entire thing was an intricate embezzlement scheme disguised as neighborhood upkeep. As an engineer trained to design efficient systems, I had to grudgingly admit there was a twisted brilliance in how Joyce had built her operation. It was criminal, but it was organized, precise fraud. Now, armed with this mountain of evidence, I knew Joyce was cornered. But instead of barging into her office, waving the receipts, or dialing the cops immediately, I decided to play it differently. If Joyce wanted to manipulate the community through infrastructure, I'd show her what genuine infrastructure expertise looked like. And that's when I turned my focus toward Clearbrook Water, the utility company supplying our entire neighborhood. If Joyce wanted to mess around with water lines, I was about to teach her what it meant to truly control the flow, because when you hold the pipes, you hold the power. Joyce had given me a crash course in the dark side of local governance, and I was prepared to turn that lesson into a weapon she'd never see coming. Clearbrook Water turned out to be a modest family-run utility company that had faithfully served our community for more than 3 decades. Owned by Edward Sterling, a wiry 68-year-old man who'd inherited the operation from his father and was visibly weary of the relentless grind, his eyes permanently etched with the look of someone carrying the weight of rusty pipes and bureaucratic paperwork. Rachel's research uncovered that Clearbrook had been limping along financially for several years, hampered by decaying infrastructure, escalating regulatory costs, and the inherent challenge of running a small utility that didn't benefit from economies of scale. And the word in industry circles was that Sterling was hunting for an exit strategy, so he could finally hang up his wrenches and enjoy retirement. As the first piece together the situation, I realized something that struck me deeper than any pipe I'd ever fixed. Sometimes the only way to change the system is to own it. For 2 decades, I'd worked under other people's rules, patching up problems and going home at night, but this was my first real chance to change the rules myself. I thought back to my very first day as a greenhorn technician, when a customer kicked me off their property yelling, "What does some water guy know about the law?" That humiliation had smoldered in me for years, sparking a quiet determination to one day be in control of the system that could so easily control people's lives. So I arranged a meeting with Sterling, telling him I wanted to discuss service issues plaguing our subdivision, and found myself in an office that smelled of dust and decades of neglected filing cabinets, surrounded by maps the color of old parchment, and a chair that squealed in protest whenever Sterling shifted his weight. He was blunt and nonsense, a man who'd clearly grown exhausted with how complicated running a utility had become in an era dominated by red tape and compliance mandates. "Clayton, I'll shoot straight with you. This business ain't what it used to be," he said, sweeping a hand across the chaos of blueprints and regulatory binders. "Used to be you fixed leaks with a wrench and some common sense. Now it's all permits, environmental assessments, and paperwork that costs more than the damn repairs." He exhaled a heavy sigh, shoulders slumping under the invisible burden of an industry he'd once loved. He admitted he'd been contemplating selling for 2 years but was wary because most prospective buyers just wanted to carve up the business for parts and merge the customer base into larger conglomerates, stripping away any personal touch. That's when Sterling surprised me by pulling out a brittle old leak detection map, unfurling it across his battered desk, and saying, "If you're as sharp as your resume claims, Show me the 3 weakest pressure points in this system. No computers, no calculators. It was like the ultimate pop quiz for my career. And after 30 seconds of tracing terrain contours and calculating pipe stress in my head, I pointed to 3 precise locations where age, elevation, and flow rates would generate the worst pressure strain. Sterling's bushy eyebrows shot up as he stared at the map. Well, I'll be damned. You nailed 2 of them dead on, and the third's been making my life hell for 6 months. He leaned back in his groaning chair and looked at me with a mixture of newfound respect and wistful regret. Funny thing, about 10 years back, some young buck came through here with big ideas about modernizing everything. I was too stubborn to listen. Guess I should have paid more attention. He didn't know that 10 years ago I'd been that ambitious kid lugging a binder full of modernization plans and pipe dreams nobody took seriously. Turns out, I thought, the blueprint outlasts the ego that rejected it. That's when I pitched my idea. For weeks I'd been crafting a thorough business plan stuffed with projections, cost-cutting strategies, and detailed compliance protocols. I'd scraped together funding through a mix of loans, personal savings, and a partnership deal with Rachel, who'd agreed to handle the mountain of regulatory hurdles and administrative management. Mr. Sterling, I'm not trying to get rich here. I just want to run a utility that actually serves its community and fixes problems instead of creating them. I told him, laying out my financial forecasts showing precisely how we could improve service and lower costs. Though Sterling's initial skepticism was palpable, my meticulous preparation and technical knowledge eventually wore down his resistance. Over the next 6 weeks, negotiations turned into an endurance test of legal paperwork, asset assessments, and financial audits, all while Joyce kept right on orchestrating her phantom infrastructure upgrades under everyone's noses. Rachel and I stayed silent about our acquisition plans because we both knew that once Joyce caught even the faintest scent of our strategy, she'd do everything in her power to derail it. We made absolutely certain the entire deal was sealed and legally ironclad before a single soul in our neighborhood got wind of it. I'd spent my career fixing the water flowing into other people's homes, but this time, I was fixing the company delivering it. The day I finally signed the papers and became the official owner of Clearbrook Water was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Sterling, clearly relieved, handed over the keys with an almost paternal warning. Clayton, just remember, owning a utility company is like being married to hundreds of people at once. Everybody's got an opinion, and none of them agree. But even he seemed excited by the modernization plans Rachel and I had envisioned. He agreed to stay on as a consultant for a year to smooth the transition, and as we shook hands, I felt a powerful certainty that real power isn't shutting off someone's water. It's making sure nobody ever has to live in fear of it being shut off. Naturally, Joyce found out about the Clearbrook acquisition within days of the ink drying. I was in my yard, repairing the patchwork damage from the waterline fiasco, when she appeared at my fence, her face twisted like she'd just bitten into a lemon she'd mistaken for an apple. Clayton, I hear you've purchased Clearbrook Water. I hope you realize this presents a significant conflict of interest concerning your role in community infrastructure decisions. Her voice was icy, taut as piano wire, the sound of someone frantically calculating her next move. I paused, dirt on my hands, and looked up from planting fresh flowers where her crew had torn up my landscaping. Joyce, I think you've misunderstood what a conflict of interest is. It's when someone uses their position to profit personally at the expense of others. You know, like approving payments to businesses owned by their relatives. I watched as her expression cycled rapidly through shock, indignation, and a dawning realization that her nephew's fake company was about to become the scandal of the year. That same night, I drafted a formal letter addressed to every resident in our subdivision. The letter introduced me as the new owner of Clearbrook Water and laid out my goals for enhancing service reliability and transparent communication. But the real purpose was to announce that Clearbrook would immediately begin a thorough review of all infrastructure to ensure compliance with modern safety and efficiency standards. Any water lines altered without proper permits or engineering oversight would have to be brought up to code within 60 days, or water service would be suspended until corrections were made. I was no longer merely a homeowner tangling with eight. Jeremiah was the person who literally controlled whether water flowed or stopped. Joyce's reply arrived the following morning in the form of a furious phone call at 6:30 a.m. Clayton, this is completely unacceptable. You cannot use your role as utility owner to retaliate against legitimate community improvement projects. I let her rant for a solid 2 minutes, then calmly explained that safety inspections and code compliance weren't revenged. They were simply the basic duties of responsible utility management, and frankly long overdue. Joyce, if the changes to our subdivision's water system were done properly with the right permits and engineering oversight, then the inspection will confirm everything's fine. But if corners were cut, or the work wasn't documented, then it's my job to fix that before it turns into a bigger problem. And the best part was that everything I was doing was not only legal, but explicitly required under state regulations. Joyce had taught me that the real leverage isn't who shouts the loudest, it's who controls the shutoff valve. I thought I had Joyce cornered. The evidence tying her to the Civic Flow Shell Company was rock solid. And now, as owner, I had the legal standing to examine every inch of the infrastructure she'd messed with. But I hadn't counted on just how skilled Joyce was at manipulating public opinion or how far she'd go to save her own skin. While I focused on collecting data and solid documentation, Joyce was quietly crafting a story that would transform me from the guy trying to save the community into the villain of her narrative. I'd always believed that if you told people the truth, they'd see it. Turns out facts might win the war, but stories win the crowd. The first clue that things were going sideways came when Gary O'Connell showed up at my door, looking worried, carrying a bundle of glossy flyers that had been slipped into every mailbox in the neighborhood. The flyers were slick and professional, screaming headlines like "Corporate Takeover Threatens Local Water Supply and Local Resident Becomes Utility Monopoly Owner." The piece de resistance was a model labeled "Privatized Water Systems at Risk," complete with tiny flags and dramatic arrows, like a science fair project run amok. "Clayton, I don't buy into this crap," Gary said, "but people are getting spooked." Apparently Joyce had been knocking on doors, personally warning everyone that I was plotting to jack up water rates and that poor old Sterling had been forced to sell against his will. The flyers were masterworks of cherry-picked facts and emotional manipulation. They talked about my conflict of interest as a utility owner, who lived in the neighborhood but conveniently omitted the entire civic flow scandal. They stoked fears about corporate greed but glossed over my 2 decades of local experience in water systems. Worst of all, they included fabricated quotes from worried residents fretting about water safety and rate hikes under new management. It was surreal to find myself painted as the villain, like I'd woken up in a community Shark Tank where everyone was dressed in khakis and armed with PowerPoint slides. Joyce's strategy was insidiously brilliant. She'd hijacked valid public fears about utility privatization to distract from her own financial crimes, by recasting me as some faceless corporate raider instead of a neighbor trying to clean up corruption. She was tapping into deep-rooted anxieties about losing control over basic necessities. Within days, I felt a shift. Friendly waves turned into stiff nods, and neighbors I'd helped fix pipes for were suddenly avoiding me like I was radioactive. The tipping point came at a hastily convened emergency HOA meeting, packed to capacity with twice the usual attendance, where Joyce stood at the front with her propaganda diorama, rattling on about how private utility ownership was somehow connected to sinister international plots. For over an hour, I watched in disbelief as she executed a flawless performance in misdirection, steering every question about HOA finances back to fears of privatization and shadowy corporations. The same neighbors who'd once trusted me now sat with wary eyes, and I realized that Joyce had effectively transformed a conversation about her own shady dealings into a referendum on whether I could be trusted to run a water company. I didn't bother arguing. I sat silently documenting every lie, because next time, I wouldn't have to speak, the facts would do it for me. I'd stumbled into a political hurricane, where truth was pulp in the blender and spin was the only thing left in the glass. Joyce had flipped the narrative so thoroughly that residents who once supported me were now second-guessing my intentions, while neighbors who'd never shown interest in HOA affairs were suddenly vocal champions of public utility ownership. I walked out of that meeting feeling battered and questioning whether I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. The real cost, not merely financial, but the blow to my reputation and the shattering realization that Joyce was far more dangerous and cunning than I'd given her credit for. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, Clearbrook's business documents spread around me like a fortress of paper, wondering if I should cut my losses. But then I flipped through the evidence Rachel and I had amassed on Civic Flow Solutions and Joyce's fraudulent schemes, and I remembered that the truth doesn't evaporate just because someone tells a prettier lie. Joyce might have won this round, but facts were stubborn things. Sitting there in the darkness, I realized she'd shown me precisely how powerful controlling the narrative could be, and more importantly, she'd made the fatal error of underestimating a man whose entire career revolved around ensuring water flowed exactly where it was supposed to flow. The following morning I woke up not defeated but invigorated, determined to play the game on my terms. Joyce had exposed her own vulnerability by going public so aggressively, proving she was afraid enough to gamble everything on smear campaigns, and she'd made the classic mistake of assuming that controlling perception was the same as controlling the facts. As someone who'd spent 2 decades fixing systems nobody even realized were broken, I knew that the best strategy sometimes involved letting your opponent trip over the very stage they'd built. Joyce might have perfected the illusion of power, but I was the guy with my hand on the shutoff valve, and tomorrow, the pressure was going to change. My first move was pure professionalism. I rolled out a communication campaign from Clearbrook, notifying every customer that a thorough infrastructure audit was underway to comply with state regulations and to improve long-term reliability. The letters were crisp, transparent, and loaded with the kind of details that breed confidence rather than suspicion. I explained that this wasn't retaliation, it was simply what a responsible utility operator does to ensure safe, legal service. And while I was determined not to make this personal, the truth was that sometimes the best revenge is doing the job your enemy only pretended to do. The audit's early results were both expected and horrifying. 34 critical safety violations, 16 quiet leaks ticking like time bombs beneath people's lawns, and 6 entire neighborhoods barely stitched together with expired permits and excuses. Asterisk, the rerouting of my own waterline was merely the tip of an iceberg of shoddy work that, while looking passable on the surface, utterly failed the test of professional standards for pressure control, leak prevention, and long-term reliability. So I documented everything meticulously, capturing photos, commissioning engineering assessments, and compiling detailed reports that spelled out exactly how each violation posed potential hazards for service quality and customer safety. And the deeper I dug, the uglier the picture became, because every single modification signed off by Joyce's chosen vendors turned out either substandard, incomplete, or downright dangerous. But the real bombshell dropped when Rachel and I cross-referenced HOA payment records to Civic Flow Solutions against the timeline of all those infrastructure improvements, revealing a pattern as glaring as neon lights on a dark highway. Because every single time the HOA cut a check to Civic Flow for supposed infrastructure upgrades, there'd be a flurry of construction activity that inevitably required extra payments for oversight and compliance checks. And the total money involved made my stomach churn, because in just 3 years, the HOA had funneled over $150,000 to Civic Flow Solutions for work that was mostly smoke, mirrors, and leaky pipes. So I took all of it, the photos of botched installations, the invoices stamped with Joyce's nephew's signature, the engineering reports, and bundled it into a thorough report titled Infrastructure, Safety, and Financial Transparency, a Community Assessment, distributing it to every household in our subdivision without spin or commentary, just pure facts, dollar figures, burst valves, and paperwork that spoke volumes all on its own. And the response was immediate, because not even an hour after those reports hit mailboxes, Gary was knocking on my door. 3 other neighbors called, and that same evening 20 signatures demanding a financial audit materialized like mushrooms after rain, proving once and for all that facts are louder than any megaphone. And once people laid eyes on undeniable evidence rather than Joyce's manipulative rhetoric, they understood at lightning speed how badly their community funds had been siphoned. With those photos of jerry-rigged pipes and bloated invoices landing harder than any political speech Joyce could concoct, and right on cue, Joyce fired back by summoning another emergency HOA meeting to frame my disclosures as personal vendettas and corporate bullying. But this time, the tide had shifted, because Gary O'Connell had spent days poring over my documents and arrived, ready to fight with facts. So when Joyce tried brushing off my report as biased, Gary cut in and started grilling her with precise questions about vendor selection, financial controls, and the HOA's suspicious spending patterns. And the entire room fell into a hush, because everyone realized Gary wasn't tossing out rhetorical questions. He wanted answers Joyce simply didn't have. And what followed was a community meeting unlike anything I'd ever seen, because Gary's pointed questions swung open floodgates, unleashing residents who'd quietly harbored suspicions, sparking queries about why certain projects had cost exponentially more than similar work in neighboring communities, and why the HOA lacked proper documentation for massive expenses. And though Joyce scrambled to assert control through parliamentary procedures and attempts at authoritative bluster, the evidence in my report had shattered her credibility beyond repair, leaving her floundering to patch leaks in a sinking ship, while the audience stood dry on the shore, watching her drown in the bureaucracy she once weaponized. And the defining moment came when someone demanded Joyce explain why Civic Flow Solutions had billed for consulting on projects that later failed, safety inspections, only for her to dodge the question and blame Clearbrook's previous management, alleging that my current safety initiatives were just a pretext to inflate utility rates. But Gary pounced, countering that many violations predated my ownership of Clearbrook by several years, proving that the truth doesn't bend just because someone tries to fold it into origami. So I didn't even need to argue, because I had invoices, regulations, and live leaks still hissing water at house number 12. And by the time the meeting ended, Joyce's grip on power had crumbled. With a petition circulating for her immediate resignation and a comprehensive financial audit, quickly amassing more than enough signatures to trigger a special election and leaving her support network evaporating under the bright glare of public scrutiny. But simply exposing Joyce wasn't enough for me, because I wanted her to face tangible consequences. And as the new owner of Clearbrook Water, one possessed both the authority and duty to enforce safety standards and regulatory compliance, which meant every water line modified without proper permits had to be fixed before service could continue. So I sent formal notices to each customer whose property was tainted by Civic Flow's sloppy work, giving them 30 days to correct the issues or face temporary suspension of water service. And though the cost of these corrections was steep, triple the normal emergency rates, it was fully justified by the high risks and tight timelines involved, because the pressure always finds the weakest point. And meanwhile, as the special election loomed on a frigid Thursday in November, I intentionally stayed away from the meeting to avoid any hint of gloating, and instead spent the evening in Clearbrook's office alongside Rachel, finalizing a new rate structure set to roll out the following month, feeling a sense of poetic justice as I sat warm and focused on community improvements while Joyce sat across town facing a blizzard of consequences. And the new rates were ingeniously fair. Customers with fully compliant water systems would pay slightly reduced rates, thanks to operational efficiency, but those with illegal or substandard modifications would pay a premium until they upgraded, translating to $80 for compliant households and a painful $260 plus fees for the shortcut club. Because fairness isn't treating everyone the same, it's charging people for the messes they create. And that same night, Gary called me with the election results, announcing that Joyce had been ousted by a margin exceeding 4-1. Even some of her loyalists turning against her once they saw the cold hard evidence of Civic Flow's financial siphoning. And Gary informed me that the new board, with him at the helm, would pursue restitution from Joyce and her nephew, alongside new procurement rules designed to prevent any repeat of such corruption. So the following Monday I mailed out the updated water bills reflecting the new structure, where most customers saw lower bills thanks to streamlined operations, but a select few including Joyce faced dramatically higher charges, with Joyce's monthly water bill rocketing from $87 to $261, reflecting her triple rate penalty for non-compliant infrastructure plus administrative processing fees. And when she called to scream about it, her voice sharp enough to strip copper from pipes, I listened calmly and told her, this isn't retaliation, it's regulation finally doing its job, explaining that the higher rates were purely actuarial, driven by the increased costs of servicing risky systems, and that if she wanted her bill reduced, she'd simply need to hire licensed contractors to bring her setup up to code. And the call was every bit as satisfying as I'd imagined, not because I was out for revenge, but because I was finally enforcing the professional standards Joyce should have respected from the start. And the best part was that everything I'd implemented was not only legal but mandated by industry regulations, because utility companies are obligated to reflect the real costs of maintaining safe, reliable infrastructure in their rates. And the irony that Joyce's own actions justified her higher bill was as perfect as a newly soldered joint. Because karma's just plumbing for the soul, the pressure builds until it bursts. And over the next few weeks, most affected homeowners chose to pay for legitimate upgrades rather than endure the premium rates, hiring proper contractors who pulled permits, used certified materials, and worked according to engineering standards. Exactly the kind of professionalism Joyce's nephew's shell company had avoided, and it was poetic that the cost of bringing those connections up to code turned out almost identical to the money the community had previously wasted on Civic Flow's worthless projects, except this time, the community was actually getting value for its dollars. Though Joyce stubbornly held out for months, seemingly hoping public pressure or some legal challenge would overturn my new policies. But when her water bills crossed $700 for a single quarter, she finally caved and paid real contractors to fix her connection. And as I'd suspected, the inspection revealed that her original reroute had been slapped together with cheap materials, improper fittings, and zero regard for maintenance or safety, necessitating a full teardown and rebuild that cost Joyce over $3,000 from her own pocket. And the final chapter came when the State Attorney General's office launched an investigation into financial dealings between several HOAs and suspicious vendors, sweeping Joyce and her nephew into the first round of charges in what blossomed into a broader crackdown on public corruption and embezzlement, with at least 3 other HOAs dragged into the spotlight, reminding me that one burst pipe can flood a whole neighborhood, but one truth can clean up the entire town. And ultimately, Joyce pleaded guilty to misappropriating community funds, was sentenced to restitution payments and community service, and her nephew's fake company was dissolved with a permanent ban on doing business with any HOA in the state, leaving me to settle into my new role running Clearbrook Water. Grateful for the lessons in patience, preparation, and the absolute power of professionalism, transforming Clearbrook into a model for transparent community utilities, with clear pricing, proactive maintenance, and customer service that treated water not as a profit vehicle but as the life-essential resource it is. And my own water connection was restored to flawless operation within a week of Joyce's downfall, my yard finally recovering from the scars of her phony infrastructure project. And in the end, I had no desire to be the neighborhood's political hero. I just wanted every resident to turn on their faucet and know they were being respected, because looking back, it all boiled down to one truth. The best way to deal with someone who abuses power is to show them what real stewardship looks like. And while Joyce had tried to dominate the neighborhood by twisting rules and spinning stories, she'd forgotten that true power lies in understanding systems and serving people's real needs. Because while Joyce played HOA chess, I rewrote the entire board and let gravity handle the rest. And if you've ever battled someone who thought a tiny slice of authority made them king, drop your story in the comments. Because trust me, I'd love to hear how you outmaneuvered your own power-hungry gatekeeper. And for now, this is RISFUL signing off. But remember, the drama, oh, it never sleeps. Tap that bell if you're ready for the next round. Thanks for watching another RISFUL original. If you enjoyed this story, Smash that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop your thoughts in the comments we read. Everyone, and remember, true power isn't in revenge, it's in rising above. Subscribe and stay fueled for justice.